topics spark more debates than the economy. We hear words like capitalism, socialism, and free markets, taxes, inflation, and economic policy almost every day. But how many of us actually understand what those terms mean and how they affect our daily life? Today's guest is an economic policy expert, author of Why Socialism Struggles. In his book, he explores why economic systems succeed or fail, explains the principles behind free misconceptions surrounding socialism, capitalism, and government policy. Today, we will discuss economics in plain language, why experts often disagree, experts often disagree, what history teaches us about different economic systems, and how better economic thinking can lead to better decisions. Once again, though, welcome to the show.
I'm happy to be here.
All right, and I hope you enjoyed that introduction.
Yes.
Okay, so I have some questions here for you, and I would like us to get into them. So, tell us about your background and what inspired you to write Socialism Struggles.
Well, I'm very concerned that there are a lot of people out there that think they like socialism without actually understanding what socialism is. I think we saw that in the election in New York, and I think we saw it in the primaries a couple of days ago, that there are people voting for socialists that don't really understand what the socialist platform is and what socialism is all about. And so my concern is that we could accidentally basically get into a situation where we get a socialist government that people voted for without ever knowing they were voting for it.
Okay, so is that what inspired you to write the book?
Yeah, that's why I decided to write the book, as a way to explain to people what economics is really all about and what socialism is really all about, what capitalism is really all about, why we have the problems we have with capitalism and how we can fix them.
Okay, thank you so much. So, socialism has become a popular topic again. Before we go into a debate, how do you define socialism and how does it differ from capitalism?
Socialism is an economic system in which the government owns all property and all means of production. In other words, there's no private property and are no private companies. Nobody is allowed to do any buying and selling of any kind. That is all done through the government. In capitalism, people own the means of production and people own all property, except for things like in the U.S. national parks. The government owns those, but people own most of the property and they own all the means of production.
Okay, so how has socialism ever actually worked in practice, and what does history tells us?
Yeah, in practice, all the evidence indicates it doesn't work. And in my own research, I've been able to prove pretty convincingly that it it can never work for several reasons. The most important one is that if the government owns the means of production, that means they have to plan what to produce. So, for example, they would have to decide, here's how many cell phones we need next year. Here's how many cars we need next year. And so on. And what kinds and how many to make and how to price them. All of those kinds of decisions would be made by the government. The problem is, in order to do that, you have to be able to predict what people are going to want to buy. And so, and by the way, that's the reason why in Russia and in China both, every time they made a 5-year plan, it failed because they predicted incorrectly. A lot of people think that there's ways that we can fix that, but they're wrong. Here's the problem. In order for me to predict how much to if I were running the government and they asked me to predict stuff, in order for me to be able to do that, I would have to know what people are planning to buy next week, next month, next year, even 5 years out, because some things it takes a long, long time to tool up to make those things. And so it's unclear how I could ever, or anyone else could ever possibly do that. I don't know what my wife is planning to buy tomorrow. I don't know what I may need to buy next week because something happens. And I certainly have no clue what I might buy 5 years from now. So it's basically an impossible task. The government can't possibly run an economy with one major caveat, and that is the only way they can do it is by making it a dictatorship and saying, we aren't going to give you a choice of what to buy. We're going to make this stuff, and that's what you're going to get. And that's typically what happens. That North Korea is a socialist country, and that's a good example. You don't get choice in North Korea. And in fact, if you buy things on the black market, for example, if you buy a pair of American jeans on the black market, it's the death penalty in North Korea. And so I don't think that most of the people that are voting for socialism know that that's what they're voting for.
Okay, thank you so much, Douglas. So, what are the ABCs of economics, and why should the average person understand them?
The ABCs of economics are that actions lead to behaviors, and those are derived from choices. And again, in socialism, in socialist countries, you don't get choice. They don't allow it. But in a capitalist country, you do get choices. Now, what the ABCs of economics means is that people make choices, and those choices lead to actions. So every time you make a choice, some action is going to occur as a result of that. Now, it may be an internal action. It just may be something you think about, but there will always be an action that follows a choice. And making the same choice over and over again ultimately leads to behaviors. That is, things that we do automatically without even making choices anymore. And that's what typically happens in a free economy is people decide to buy something and they act on that. And if you're buying on Amazon, for example, you may turn that into a behavior automatically by having it automatically delivered every month. And so in a free economy, everything is based on choice. And those choices all derive from our individual values. And that's another big problem with socialism is that it imposes values, it doesn't honor values. And so people all value things differently. And the easy way to know that is for all of our listeners to think about their friends and family. Just take a minute now and ask yourselves, do you all drive the same kind of car? Do you all listen to the same kind of music? Do you all have the same brand of cell phone? Do you all go to the same sites on the internet? Do you all go to the same restaurants, the same clubs, the same churches? And my guess is the answer for almost everyone is no to all those questions. And the reason it's no is because different people value different things. So they make different choices. And that's the way we want the world to be. We want everybody to be free to use their own values to determine what happens in their life, including what happens in their economic life. Let them make their own economic choices. And that's what a free economy, a capitalist economy, allows people to do.
Your book discusses evidentiary economics.
Yes.
What does that mean, and how is it different? ideology, opinion.
Yeah, evidentiary economics is examining economics not from a standpoint of what we would like to have happen, but from a standpoint of what the evidence says works. A good example of non-evidentiary economics is economics that is ideologically based. That is, it's based on what people believe. It's based on what people want to have happen, but it's not based on any evidence that it will actually work in reality. A good example is the song "Imagine" by John Lennon. I'm a big Beatle fan, and John Lennon's terrific, but he wasn't an economist. And so when he writes a song imagining a world that there's no private property, no uh, religion, no anything. I mean, he rules out a whole bunch of things. That's ideological economics. That is, it's economics based on what you believe could work, but there's no evidence that it could work or would work. And in fact, every time, there are no exceptions, every time socialism has been tried, it's failed. It's just that simple. Um, and there's good reasons for that. Part of my research was to look at how well the Federal Reserve could predict what people would buy a year ahead of time. They were right 46% of the time. You could have literally been done better flipping a coin.
Okay, thank you so much. So I hope people can begin to understand what evidentiary economics actually means. So I said, Douglas, in your view, what makes tax system effective?
I mean, almost any tax system can be effective. I think the question is what kind of a tax system is most effective or is most effective in terms of how it deals with the people. And I'm a flat tax person. That is, I think that the whole idea of taxing income, first of all, uh, is a bad idea. Um, Whenever you tax something, you're basically punishing the behavior you're taxing. And so if you're taxing income, you're basically saying we want people to not make income because if they make it, we're going to take part of it away. I think the far better thing is to do what many European countries do, and that is have a national sales tax, a flat sales tax. In most of Europe, it runs between 15 and 25%. And, we could quibble about the numbers, but now what you're doing is taxing spending. You're not taxing income. What are the advantages? Well, first of all, it eliminates the need for the Internal Revenue Service. You don't have to have a huge, complicated bureaucracy. Most countries here in the U.S., almost every city and state already has the mechanisms to do a sales tax. So all you have to do is do that. I mean, and you're done. You could get rid of the entire Internal Revenue Service because there'd be nothing for them to do. That alone would save tons and tons of money because I know, I don't know about a lot of our listeners, but I pay an accountant to do my taxes. It's just way too complicated. I'm an economist and I can't figure it out. So, uh, uh, all of us would benefit by having just a flat sales tax. Uh, People often say we should be taxing the rich more, and the rich are already paying way more than their fair share. The example I use in my book is if you think of it as taking a hike and carrying backpacks, if you divide up a 10-pound weight among 100 people and then apply the U.S. tax system to that, so every person starts out with 10 pounds, every one of the 100 people, but then we divide it up the way the U.S. tax system is divided up. Well, the top 1% or so would end up carrying 420 pounds. The next group would be carrying about 100 pounds, the next group about 50 pounds, and the bottom half would be carrying nothing. The rich are already paying their fair share and more.
Wow. Wow. Okay. So, is economics really about money, or is it fundamentally about something much broader?
It's definitely about something far broader. Um, every decision that every organism makes is an economic decision, not just people. Every organism makes economic decisions because all economics is a way to use resources. And so every organism, every person has resources. They have time, they have energy, they have calories, they have things that they use all the time. And when they do that, they have to make choices about what to do with those things. How are they going to spend their time? Like you and I right now, and our listeners have decided to spend this time together sharing this podcast. We could have all been doing other things, but we chose to do this. That was an economic decision. It has nothing to do with whether we're going to make money or spend money or have anything to do with money. And in fact, like I said, all organisms make those choices. I have horses. If I go down and toss a bale of hay 100 feet from the horses and put another one 500 feet away, I can tell you absolutely they're going to go to the one 100 feet away. They're going to choose to go to the nearer one. Now, do horses figure that stuff out? I don't think so. But somehow they know that if they go to the nearer one, they will burn less calories getting to the new calories than they would if they went to the 500 foot away one. And so, same thing with even plants. If you put a plant in a room, it will always grow toward the light. Always. Because it knows that, and when I say knows, of course, I don't think plants are actually conscious and thinking about this stuff, but somehow they are able to choose to grow toward the light where they can get what they need rather than grow toward the dark and not get what they need. And so every single choice that every organism makes is ultimately an economic choice. And I think it would help people a lot if they did that more consciously. I think too many people, I want to say maybe punish themselves almost by not really thinking about how they're choosing to spend their resources. Are they wasting time? Are they wasting money? Are they wasting energy? And I think if people spent more time thinking about that, they'd be a lot happier, healthier, and a lot smarter.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Doe. So, if you could teach every high school student one lesson about economics before they graduate, what would it be?
Wow, that's a tough one. Well, some of the things we've talked about, but I guess one of the most important things is the idea of value. Um, too many people think that things or actions or uh, spending has some particular value. That is, many people would tell you immediately that gold has value. And that's sort of true, but only sort of true. Gold itself has no value at all. Gold only has the value we give it. And a real simple way to see that is to go online and ask for a 1 year chart of gold prices. If gold had some intrinsic value, obviously that price would stay the same forever. But if you look at a gold chart, it goes up and down all the time because gold has no intrinsic value. I saw a fascinating headline a few weeks ago that said that the asteroid Psyche had enough gold to make everybody on Earth a billionaire. Now, let's do a little thought experiment. If Psyche should leave its orbit and enter the Earth's atmosphere and break up because of the friction and spread 6 inches of gold over the entire world, what would the value of gold now be? And I would suggest that the value of gold at that point would be negative. Things can have negative value. Negative value means you pay to get rid of it. And that's exactly what would happen to gold in the scenario I described. Because I know I would be delighted to pay somebody to come to my yard, shovel up all the gold and take it away. Because I don't want my yard lined with gold. I want my yard with grass in it and trees and stuff like that. And so having a ton of gold would increase the supply so much that it would become virtually worthless. And it's important, and the value that anything has derives from our personal values. We talked about those a little bit a few minutes ago, but we all have our own values on things, and the value of something like gold is the amalgamation of the value that each of us has for it. In other words, it's an average of how all of the 9 billion people on the planet value gold. And some people will value it a lot more than others. I mean, if you're out in the middle of nowhere and you're super hungry and there's no stores around and you have a choice between a meal and gold, you're going to pick the meal because the gold won't get you anything. And so all of our choices depend on things like that. Not too long ago, someone questioned my military service and said, why would you choose to put your life on the line like that? And I said, well, that's just something I value. I believe in duty, honor, country. And to me, it's a privilege to serve. And it would be a privilege if I had to get killed doing it. And the person that I was talking to was visibly shocked. They couldn't understand. They really couldn't grasp how somebody could feel that way. And I'm not putting that down. My point is we have different values, and that's not a value they had, but it is a value that I have.
Okay, that's actually very, very true. Honestly, uh, I can see it now from your own perspective, and I wish and I hope every high school student can take this lesson from this. So, for someone who wants to become a more informed citizen when evaluating economic policies, where should they begin?
Well, I think the first place is to look at what you're trying to achieve with those economic policies. And in general, capitalism, in fact, on my website, dougcardell.com, my latest series of articles is showing how the economy functions very much like the natural environment. And over the last 100 years, we've learned the hard way that the natural environment is not something we should be tinkering with. We've done lots and lots of, over the last 100 years, interventions into the environment, and they've all backfired horribly. One good example would be in the early 20s. They got concerned about the deer population on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, called the Kaibab Plateau. And what they did to try and solve the problem was they put a bounty on predators, wolves, mountain lions, so that people would go out there and start killing them. And it worked. Predators started getting killed off. What happened as a result of that was the deer population exploded. And it got so huge that in very little time, they were able to eat up all the resources. Now, the plateau there that they're on, they can't easily get on and off of it. So once they ate up all the resources, they couldn't go somewhere else. And so the deer started dying in droves. And the few that remained were only saved by us flying in hay until the population started to rebuild, and until we took the bounty off of the wolves and mountain lions, and other predators. Uh, we've tried lots and lots of interventions like that. Another good example is forest fires. Uh, our policy for many years was every time a fire started in a forest, we would rush in and put it out. We found out that that's a really bad idea because forests, to be healthy, have to have forest fires. But what you want is for the forest fire to kind of race through with a small amount of fuel so that the big trees don't get hurt. Only the litter on the forest floor gets burned up. What happens, though, if you put out all the fires is that litter on the forest floor builds up and builds up and builds up and builds up so that now when a fire does start, it's too big for us to put it out, and it's big enough to set the whole forest on fire. I could spend the rest of our time here going through things like that didn't work. Well, the economy is a very similar thing. What we've changed to do now in the environment is basically leave it alone. We've learned to understand that the environment is way too complicated for us to control. Because if we do one little thing here, it ripples through tons and tons of other things. Somebody mentioned on a podcast yesterday that fireflies in New York were dying out. And I wasn't clear exactly on why, but those fireflies in New York dying out will set in motion a huge chain of events because something eats those fireflies. Something depends on those fireflies, and something depends on the things that eat the fireflies. Something depends on the things that the fireflies do, and so on and so on and so on. And so you're going to have big problems that you didn't envision. Another example would be like when we learned about DDT, environmental poison. We were use DDT to poison insects to make crops better, but we found out that birds, lizards, lots of other animals ate those insects that we were poisoning, and they all died. And so what we've learned now about the environment is don't try and manage it, protect it. Now, what do I mean by protect it? Protect it means we don't mess with it, the government that is, but we don't allow anybody else to mess with it either. And so, for example, pollution, that's somebody messing with the environment. And so the government has a perfect right to stop pollution. There are lots of things that dumping toxic waste in a river. You can think of them as quickly as I can. There are lots of things out there that people could do to the environment. It's the government's job to stop them. The same basic thing is true in economics. Capitalism requires a free market, but too often the government tampers with it, just like we used to tamper with the environment. And there are backlashes. It creates problems that are worse than the problems they tried to solve. A good example was the housing crisis in 2007, 2008. The government tried to make it easier for people to get home loans. And so they ended up reducing the standards to the point where people who really couldn't afford home loans and weren't going to be able to pay them back got home loans. And so what happened? The housing market boomed and then crashed, just like the deer population did on the Kaibab Plateau. Exactly the same kind of a structure. And the government was being well-meaning, but they were fiddling with things that are too big for us to understand. And so what the government needs to do is don't intervene in the economy, but also keep other people from intervening. So if some bad guys over here are setting up a monopoly, the government should stop them. If there's somebody doing things that are economically bad, the government should stop them. And I call these things guardrails. The environment should have guardrails, and the economy should have guardrails. But the government has no business interfering with it because it's too complicated. And I know for a lot of people that's hard to understand, but this is not exactly an economic example, but it's a really good example of how government messes with stuff it doesn't understand and gets in trouble. What did the food pyramid say? It said eat a lot of carbohydrates and don't eat fat, basically. What did we get as a result? An obesity epidemic. I mean,
Yes,
we literally have people eating themselves to death
yes,
because they chose to eat carbohydrates instead of a healthy diet. And so that's a really good example of the government trying to do good. I understand that. They're trying to help, but they got bad advice and they acted on it and killed a whole lot of people, probably millions. And so uh, we don't want the government taking control of things that are too big for them to deal with. They need to stay in their own lane and keep people from doing things that keep companies, like if a company started marketing carbohydrates as safe to eat, if they were saying you should be eating, if a company came out with ads saying you need to eat a pound of sugar a day, the government would be absolutely right to say, no, you can't do that. There's no evidence to support that. You're not allowed to say that. Um, but they shouldn't be saying it either because they don't know any better. And in fact, the whole idea of a diet plan is just dumb. I'm a runner and a weightlifter. And as a result of that, I can probably burn a lot more calories than many other people. And so a one size fits all diet. If I were to have my wife and I, who I outweigh by 50 pounds or so at least, and uh, since she has a hurt knee, she can't run. If we were to eat the same diet, if I ate her diet, in no time at all, I would lose a ridiculous amount of weight and strength, and I'd hardly be able to move. If she ate my diet, she'd get dramatically fat very quickly. And so saying that there's a diet that's right for all people is just crazy. A 400-pound sumo wrestler is going to eat very differently than a 90-pound Pilates instructor.
okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Doe. I said, for those who would like to connect with you and learn more about what you do, how can they do that?
Oh, you bet. Well, two ways. My website, dougcardell.com. There are over 100 articles there explaining a huge amount about economics. Or I would encourage them to buy my book. I think my book does a really good job. If they read the reviews on Amazon, it will tell you that the people who have read it will say that they've learned to understand economics a whole lot better without a lot of complication and fancy vocabulary and stuff like that. It's an easy question and answer format that will teach people a whole lot about economics that they don't know.
Okay, thank you so much. And I really appreciate you for coming. And my audience, thank you guys so much. And if this episode is speaking to you, make sure to share it to someone out there who needs to hear this. Thank you all so much. And I'll see you guys on the next episode. Bye, guys. Thank you, Dr. Joe.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Have a wonderful day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye bye.